Who remembers classic cartoons, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Transformers, The Smurfs, DuckTales, and just so many more? Your mind is no doubt running to the classics that you and your friends remember, and heck, you may even be thinking back to that classic video game adaptation based on the game. However, today I want to bring up those cartoons that you remember. However, when you bring them up to a group of people of the same age, you're surrounded by nothing but confused faces. These are the kids' TV shows that time has almost forgotten, shows that will in time be completely forgotten about, and shows that will likely become lost media. Although, let's be honest, that may actually be a good thing. Let's not kid ourselves here, guys. The reasons that you, and probably you alone, remember these cartoons is because they were crap, resulting in these licenses being sold on the cheap and game publishers creating games on the cheap. And it's my unfortunate job to make sure that we never forget properties that we kinda wish we could. Today I plan to look back at 5 cartoons that have all been long dead, mostly forgotten about, and of course, find every single video game based on each property. Are they forgotten because they are bad? Let me know down below, and of course share your favourite forgotten cartoon and video game spin-off after hitting the subscribe button and the bell as I talk you through 5 shows that you almost definitely did forget. Welcome to Slope's Game Room. Who remembers Bangers and Mash?
Bangers and mash, bangers and mash, them chimps are in there right now.
Not to be confused with Bangers and Mash, the popular British dish of the same name consisting of sausages and mashed potato. Mash being the mash and bangers being the sausage. Which, by the way, got its name due to a meat shortage in World War I, resulting in sausages being filled with random fillers, including water, that would cause the sausages to explode when cooked. And no, I'm not talking about the other form of Bangers and Mash either. Nope, I ain't talking about any of that. I'm talking about the TV show that aired between 1989 and 1993. Originally starting their life as a series of popular children's books from the very early 80s, the Chimps That Are Imps made their way onto TV with one of the most British theme tunes ever, performed by legendary Rockney duo Chaz and Dave, only ever really getting exported to New Zealand and Australia, where the show performed well enough. But of course, none of this matters because its real home was right here in the UK. And as this show continued to air into the 90s, in 1992 we got our very own Amstrad and ZX Spectrum game based on the cartoon. Playing kinda like a reverse Alex Kidd where you work your way up a vertical platforming layout, you take control of Banger, collecting fruit on your way up the level, and if you don't get every single piece, well, you can't continue on. Thankfully you have pies and a hell of a lot of them, which you use to destroy everything in your path in order to get to the top, and yes, even Mash makes an appearance too. Overall, it's not terrible for a budget title, but I wouldn't say it's honestly very good. It's unsurprisingly bloody hard to control, as a lot of these budget titles are, and one little tidbit of knowledge for you: the game was coded by legendary bedroom coder Richard Stevenson, who was responsible for the Dave Mirra predecessor BMX Ninja. Yes, that last part may not be entirely true, but he did make the game, as well as that Popeye boxing game we brought up before, where you fight a Xenomorph from Aliens and the B9 robot from Lost in Space. Yeah, I wonder if they got the license for those properties. Who remembers Count Duckula? Starting off in Danger Mouse, or should I say before he got his own show. The history behind this character came in after Nickelodeon had purchased the American broadcasting rights for Danger Mouse, and it had become quite a hit for that channel. Nickelodeon reached out to Cosgrove Hall Films in order to make a new show, and upon visiting the studio, the head of Nickelodeon, Jerry Laybourne, saw a picture of Count Duckula in Brian Cosgrove's office and shouted that I want that one. And with that, the series was quickly greenlit. with the main character voiced by British legend David Jason, aka Del Boy from Only Fools and Horses. The popular British cartoon ended up running for 4 seasons, resulting in 65 episodes and a spin-off of its own called Victor and Hugo. It also got itself a short-run Marvel comic series, a couple of audiobooks, and of course a couple of video games.
Hey, Count Duckula!
Count Duckula, no sax please, we're Egyptian? What? Count Duckula and his faithful servants Iger and Nanny have transported themselves and their castle over to the land of the pharaohs, Egypt. There they decide to search for the mystic sax, an ancient saxophone with strange magical powers. They know that the sax is hidden somewhere in the tomb of the great pharaoh Akhenaten, a gigantic pyramid in the middle of the desert. What they do not know is that they have also brought along some unwanted guests in the shape of the Crow brothers. Okay. So it looks like the game is actually based on one of the episodes from the show, and that episode's title was a parody of a popular, for the time, 1970s British theatre production called No Sex Please, We're British, before getting turned into a Ronnie Corbett movie a couple of years later, and although quite popular, both were completely panned. Okay. Regardless, none of this has anything to do with arguably the most popular episode of Count Duckula, the audiobook of the same name, or the game of the same name. For the time, this budget £2.99 title was actually not all that bad. I suppose in the absolute loosest sense possible, you could call this a Metroidvania, as you run around a maze-like world with no in-game map, I might add, trying your best to dodge enemies as they reduce your time, collecting keys and random other bits and bobs, then through the process of trial and error, working out what doors to unlock. Honestly, without a map, you're never going to be getting anywhere in this game, and the terribly tacked-on Snap game obviously doesn't save it. Moving on to Count Duckula 2. This terrible title was released 2 years later, and sadly is far worse than the original. After you played a really rather strange shoot-'em-up level, you enter the world's most basic and frustrating platform game. Obviously, just by looking at this, you'll know if this game is for you, but just in case you're a simpleton, let me tell you, it's not. Who remembers Bravestarr?
Bravestarr.
The Western space adventure created by Filmation that was so cool they added an extra R to his name. Ho-ho, now we're talking. Of course, this TV show was created to sell action figures. Action figures that actually go for stupid money these days, guys. Bloody hell, there really is a fan base for everything, right? Jokes aside, I actually remember really enjoying this 65 episode long series that was sadly the last ever full series created by Filmation that started its life during the production of Ghostbusters. No, not the real Ghostbusters, just Ghostbusters, that gorilla show thing. The series did well enough for a full-length animated movie to be produced, as well as a spin-off show that started production called Bravo. Or did it? Because Bravo sadly never got finished, as Filmation went out of business. But why? It was popular, right? Heck, I liked it. As stated, this whole show was created to sell action figures, big 8-inch action figures I might add, much bigger and therefore better than whatever else was on the shelf, of which us 80s kids had absolutely loads to choose from. You see, as much as I enjoyed Bravestarr R for what it was, most people didn't. Mattel had seriously made bank off the back of selling He-Man toys and God knows whatever other merch related to that show, and I was 100% part of that generation. The thing is, when something as big as He-Man jumps on board, you can be damn sure that copycats are gonna come a-knocking soon after, resulting in Mattel trying to keep up with those copycats, and in Bravestarr R's case, failing. It's a very vicious cycle. You guys think we've got it bad nowadays, with adverts being constantly shoved down our necks showing us what we will be getting. It was no different back then. Bravestarr R was literally an advert that had been stripped of all of its soul and heart after Filmation had pitched the idea to Mattel, and with their previous successes and failures, produced something that honestly was pretty forgettable, even if, again, I actually remember quite liking it. They changed his colour scheme, his town, the length of his hair, loads of his magical abilities, and even his name, simply because toy testing proved that changing all of those things will make boys like the toys more. Plus, extra emphasis on the guns, please. No, seriously, more guns, more guns, more guns! Considering Bravestarr R's powers were still quite a big part of the show, Mattel wanted more guns, goddammit, because He-Man's laser toy line proved to be so popular that you can be damn sure every bloody Bravestarr R toy will include these laser toy things too. The end result, as you may have guessed, is the perfectly well created and crafted and marketed toy for young boys like me at the time. However, and here's the real kicker, it came out a whole 10 months before the TV show aired, resulting in a TV show with a character that was created by a toy company, and it just didn't adapt very well. Of course, by the time the show did air, it picked up a little bit of steam, but by then, the damage was done. Bravestarr R was a short-lived franchise that proved creating shows off the back of toy lines and not the other way around could cost you big bucks, and in this case, an entire animation studio. Regardless, Mattel did try. They tried bloody hard to get this thing to succeed by not just releasing toys, but also all of the typical merch, including a pretty decent video game. Yep, you heard that right. Bravestarr R's video game that was created by Probe in 1987 for the ZX Spectrum, Amstrad and Commodore 64 was actually, well, it was alright. The reason I was such a fan was probably because I was such a fan of Green Beret, known then as Green Beret, by 7-year-old me. In the game, you run left and right shooting all sorts of bad guys, collecting clues that will lead you to different parts of the map, and you keep going until the onslaught of bad guys kill you. Because they are hard, they are fast, they are constant, and you are going to die pretty much consistently trying to get past them. Sadly, it's the sheer amount of enemies suicide bombing their way into you that actually kills the game for most people. They are constant and they never stop. And the reason for this is because the game's very short. You are probably going to be completing this bad boy in an hour or so, a lot less with cheats on, which although may be pretty standard for home computer games, really shouldn't be the case for fully priced home computer games. It's sickening because if they did level out all of the difficulty a little, and I don't know, at least double the length, you would probably be looking at a really solid title here. Sadly, however, it wasn't, and it's believed that the game was rushed due to the popularity of the toy line and show pretty much getting cancelled left, right and centre by the time that this game was released. Who remembers Edd the Duck? The co-presenting puppet that would work alongside Andy Crane and eventually Andy Peters on the Broom Cupboard on the BBC during the late 80s and early 90s. Yes, I know this one isn't a cartoon, but come on, is there really enough content out there to create an entire video based on forgotten puppets? Yeah, Edd the Duck. This is what your TV license paid for, guys. For those outside of the UK, a TV license is a fee that everyone in the UK must pay if they decide to watch the BBC. Yes, everyone. Strangely enough, I actually had this game as a kid for the Amstrad, and would you believe it? I enjoyed playing it. Honestly, I knew no better back then.
The one and only Edd the Duck!
Before I was happening, Duckman Zero. Now I'm around, Edd means hero. So rap with me to this cool ballad. I'm telling you now, I'm one funky melody.
If I remember correctly, I purchased this with my own money, so of course no matter how crap it was, I was going to enjoy it, goddammit. And that's exactly what I did, or at least that's what I told myself I did. Perhaps it was the overwhelming similarity to Rainbow Islands that grabbed my attention, being that was a favourite game of mine. Regardless, this was one of those few big budget titles that I ever purchased with my own money at around about £10. And boy oh boy, duck season is open, guys. So in keeping with Edd the Duck, you need to dodge Wilson the butler, making your way to the top, and as you can see, the duck has his iconic green mohawk that was salvaged out of an old Blue Peter teddy bear, apparently. Yep, again, we the taxpayers paid for this. Thankfully other ports do play slightly better, although it was worth pointing out that the Amiga port that was criminally priced £24.99, where the title screen does actually show the correct spelling of the studio that coded it, that being Impulse rather than Impulse. Good job, Amstrad coders. Also, congratulations to the coders that forgot to add the 20th star to the 7th stage in this game, meaning that it was completely uncompletable from the get-go. Or at least that's what I found other people saying online, because if I'm gonna be honest, this game is way too painful to play to get anywhere near that 7th scene. Annoyingly, because this game actually did sell well, sorry about that guys, it actually did get a sequel. Let's get this over with. Edd the Duck, back with a quack as a side-scroller based in the Wild West for whatever reason, which is probably better than the original, but barely. By the time this game came out, we already had titles such as Sonic 1 and 2, the original trilogy of Mario games and Mario World, Zool, and a whole heap more. A terrible game based on, quite frankly, a terrible puppet character. Although let's be frank, we Brits never really got Jim Henson quality based puppetry here, did we? God, that's going to piss off some sooty and sweep enthusiasts, isn't it? Who remembers Attack of the Killer Tomatoes? Or as you Yanks like to say, Attack of the Killer
Tomato.
Originally starting its life as a 1978 parody spoof movie with a real-life helicopter crash that has actually made it into the movie. It's insane that this is in the movie, but thankfully no one was actually injured. The pilot got away from this. The budget flick that received terrible reviews upon release turned into such a success that it spawned 3 sequels, the first of which included a very young George Clooney in one of his earliest roles, a book spin-off called Attack of the Killer Potatoes, a comic book spin-off of the original story, and of course, the far more recognisable cartoon show that consisted of 2 seasons and 21 episodes, that confusingly actually follows the story of the sequel instead of the original flick. Which brings us to a whole heap of rather terrible video games, and even though this video is based on popular cartoon video game adaptations, let's start with the movie adaptation of this franchise, as that obviously came first. Released on the Amstrad ZX Spectrum and MSX, the game is an isometric styled affair where you must venture forth through the maze-like world, killing tomatoes and then taking them back to the main room where you have to squash them down into puree. It's not exactly an easy game to get through these days and becomes quite a bit tedious before it becomes fun, in all honesty, due to spending most of your time lost turning what is essentially a 30-minute experience into a several-hour boring experience. Of course, if you really do love games such as Head Over Heels or even the first ever Batman game, then of course you may enjoy this more than I did. Heck, the reviews were pretty good for the time, so you can't really hate on it too much. Thankfully, this game was based on the original movie, and obviously after that we got the kids' TV show, which also got a couple of video game adaptations, this time for the NES and the original Game Boy. Now both of these games actually play different to one another. Chad is the star of the cartoon, so of course he was the star of the NES game, and in true 90s fashion it's a platformer, and again in true 90s fashion, as it's a tie-in game, it's a crap platformer. Okay, so it's not completely terrible, and I've got to say that it does actually look quite nice for the NES. Sadly, the precision needed to actually jump on top of the enemies is a bit too precise, but thankfully the game is incredibly forgiving with health pickups and lives, so you will likely complete the title before the day is through. Just as long as you work on mastering the game's flaws, it's an incredibly forgettable game that is, I suppose, worth a try. That is, if you have absolutely nothing else to play. Now, as stated, they also made a game based on this cartoon for the Game Boy, and this time you control Wilbur Finletter, and credit where credit's due. They actually tried to replicate the way he acted in the movie and the cartoons for this game. If you're thinking to yourself that the guy doesn't really look all that fun to play as, well, obviously, you are right. Wilbur is not fun to play as. He has an incredibly steep, floaty jump, and more often than not you'll find yourself being attacked pretty much consistently by the tomatoes. What I will say is that the game is probably my favourite out of all of the Attacker Killer Tomatoes games, but really that's not saying all that much. The possible reason for this was because the company Equilibrium had 3 licenses for games at the same time: Bo Jackson, Hit and Run, The Flash, and this. Bo Jackson ended up taking so long that it had a knock-on effect for the extra 2 titles, and therefore this title was very much rushed. Even up until the last minute when they decided to add fire buttons to the start and select buttons of a Game Boy. A terrible way to control a platformer for the system, as I'm sure you will all agree. It had grand plans, but alas, due to those tight deadlines, it ended up being quite forgettable. And if you think that's everything to do with Attack of the Killer Tomatoes, think again. Because as of the making of this episode, there's talks of a reboot being made for Attack of the Killer Tomatoes, and obviously with this reboot, we've got another game. What the actual is this? I can't believe I'm paying for this, guys. Okay, one sec. Ah, it's broken. That just cost me $1. Hey there, guys. I hope you enjoyed that video. It's a bit of a different one than I normally do with my Kickscammers and my Complete History videos, but I fancied doing something a little bit a bit more fun, a bit more relaxing, and I actually really enjoyed going back through those old cartoons. By the way, anyone that can work out the name of every single cartoon right at the beginning of this episode, please put it down below. I'll put a pinned comment and you get all of the points. But anyway, this is the part of the video where I'd like to give a massive shout out to all of the patrons and YouTube members that allow me to make these videos every single week. You guys can sign up too. There'll be links down below and you'll be able to see all of these videos early. You'll be able to see exclusive videos in the back end of YouTube, and plenty of other awesome perks over in Discord and what else I'm working on, all that sort of stuff. But yeah, all those names you see down there, all of those people support me, and let's give some extra big shout out to the following members: Aaron Gorman, Agro Crag, Akatimo84, Andrew Dalton, Arista, Benjamin Guy, Big Rico, Bram Perez, Chev Matic, Chris the Shapeshifter, Christopher Devero, Clam Bob, Conrad Constantine, De Action Saxon, Dina81, Game Apologist, Gary Pinkett, Ian Quell, Intrigues Gaming, a Tulky Teacher, The Ashen Knight, Jay is Manchild, Jabba Al Aiden, James, Jeff Mianowski, Jeremy Bauer, Jeremy Rodriguez, Josh Yaskatis, hope I'm saying that right, sorry if I'm not, Josh Gibbons, King Link Reviews, King of Carrot Flower, Lucas Softail, Man Shovel, Matt Jackson, Michael Ridley Dash, Mike Fallon, Mind of the Unsane, Nicholas Burner, Nick Pollard, Over Giles Zane, Roll VP, Ray Blair, Retro to Next Gen aka Lou, Richard Alderjick, Rovan Army, Sir Nielsen, Shadow Dragon, Solix Captor, Stephen, Taylor Rainwater, That Gamer, The Cunning Linguist, The Sneaky Ferret, Tim Lund, Todd Poolflow G, Vitas Varnes, Vike Echo, Wubbles and Bean, The Wonder Ducks, and Ye Old Hamburglar. Thank you to all of you guys. However you guys decide to support me, the number one way you can support me is by subscribing and hitting that bell. It lets you guys know when I'm creating new content, and yeah, that's without a doubt the best thing you can do, or sharing my content. However you decide to support me, I cannot thank you guys enough. Thank you to absolutely everybody that's definitely got this far in the video. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I love this and I love you guys for watching. Thank you. But until next time, guys, this is DJ Soap signing out, and hopefully I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.